Have you ever wondered about the hidden heroes among us? Those who make impossible choices, not for glory, but for a silent truth deeper than any rulebook? Imagine a decorated soldier bound in steel handcuffs, standing accused of a crime, yet her quiet strength hints at a story far more profound than any courtroom could reveal. What if the very act that branded her a criminal was in fact an extraordinary moment of self-sacrifice? Join us as we unravel a gripping tale of courage, prejudice, and the unwavering spirit of a woman who defied the odds to redefine what it means to serve with honor. Steel backbone of everything he had once hoped the ghost operators could be. The clinking of her handcuffs echoed faintly as she moved toward the defendant's table, her boots steady despite the weight of judgment pressing down from every corner of the packed room. Emma Briggs kept her chin level, eyes locked ahead, refusing to give the murmuring crowd the satisfaction of seeing her falter. Every whisper, every skeptical glance cut into her like a blade, but she bore it silently, gripping that last thread of dignity as if it were her only weapon left. On the bench, Admiral Gregory Shaw flipped open the thick manila file marked Briggs, E. His hand froze just as he touched the first page, his practiced detachment faltering when he saw the words and commendations written there. His gaze darted up, narrowing slightly as he regarded the woman standing before him now. The name rang louder in his mind than in his ears. Lieutenant Emma Briggs, the only female SEAL in a classified unit so secret it didn't officially exist. And she had not just served, she had excelled. 20 missions, many of them Black Ops never acknowledged in any public record, and yet her name was synonymous, at least in those hidden circles, with grit, precision, and relentless courage. Shaw's jaw tightened. Whatever else she had done, he thought grimly, this was no ordinary defendant. Emma's own mind kept flashing back, against her will, to that day, the day that had led her here. The heat of gunfire crackling overhead, the shouted orders that couldn't drown out the sound of a child crying. A little girl no older than 8, barefoot and covered in dust, crouched between enemy lines right where Emma's unit had fortified their position. Protocol was clear. Don't break formation. Don't compromise the team. Let command handle civilian recovery later. But Emma hadn't even hesitated. The girl's wide, terrified eyes so much like her own little sister's, had cut through every rule drilled into her over a decade of training. She'd bolted. The memory came back in fragments. The deafening roar of bullets tearing up the ground around her, the fiery sting of shrapnel biting into her shoulder, the child's tiny hands clutching her uniform as she lifted her, shielding her body with her own. 30 seconds. That sprint across open ground had felt like an eternity, yet she had reached the other side alive, with the girl safe in her arms. When it was over, every single member of her team was still breathing. The mission's objectives had been achieved. The girl reunited with her family. To Emma, that had been enough. But to Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, it was ammunition of a different kind. Webb had always worn his contempt for her just thinly enough to escape formal reprimand, his disdain for a woman in his unit impossible to miss. And here was his chance, her judgment called into question, her devotion to her team painted as weakness. In his report, he wrote nothing of the girl she had saved, nothing of the lives preserved because she had drawn fire away. Instead, his words had described her as emotional, reckless, a liability. He filed charges for unauthorized deviation from orders and endangering the mission. And so here she stood now, under the harsh fluorescent lights of a military courtroom, steel biting into her wrists, every eye upon her. The spectators saw only what they'd been told to see, a young woman too soft to hold the line, too impulsive to trust. None of them saw the nights she'd spent bleeding in deserts and jungles to bring her team home. None of them saw how many men and women owed her their lives. None of them cared. Emma's gaze drifted past the rows of watching faces and found the American flag behind the Admiral's bench. Her chest rose and fell slowly as she fixed her eyes there, as though the stars and stripes themselves could give her strength. She wasn't fighting for the crowd. She wasn't even fighting to save her own career. She was fighting for the idea stitched into that fabric, that doing the right thing, even when no one else understood, was still worth it. Admiral Shaw's fingers gripped the edge of the file as he read deeper. His reputation was built on his unwavering adherence to discipline, his belief that rules were the foundation of order. But now he felt the ground shifting beneath him as he pieced together the story hidden between the sterile lines of her record. 2 decades earlier, he himself had envisioned and quietly authorized the Ghost Operators program, a clandestine, near-impossible initiative to build a unit capable of facing missions no one else dared touch. He knew better than anyone how few ever measured up. Fewer than 1 in 100 made it through. Yet here was this young woman before him, her wrists bound, her name in his file, and her record proving she had not only measured up, but carried the weight of that impossible standard through mission after mission without breaking. And now she stood there, accused not because she'd failed, but because she'd chosen to save a life. Shaw set the file down, staring at her with a new, more searching intensity. The courtroom remained silent, as though holding its breath, and in that heavy silence he understood. Whatever the law said, this woman was the very embodiment of the Ghost Operator's creed. Emma felt his eyes on her but didn't flinch. She kept her shoulders squared and her jaw set. Whatever happened next, she was ready to bear it. Pinnacle of everything he had spent his entire career building. The irony of it struck him like a cruel joke. Here he was, the very architect of the Ghost Operator program, now presiding over the court-martial of its greatest success. When Emma Briggs stepped into the courtroom, the air was already alive with whispers, a low hiss of judgment curling through the gallery. "Probably just here to meet some diversity quota," someone muttered loud enough to be heard. The court security officer approached her with mechanical detachment, snapping the cold restraints around her wrists. His expression carried only mild contempt, as though she was yet another arrogant soldier who thought the rules didn't apply. Emma didn't flinch. She didn't so much as blink. Every syllable of scorn reached her ears, but her heart had grown too callous to let it cut anymore. Her eyes stayed locked on the flag that hung behind Admiral Shaw's bench, unyielding, defiant. She wasn't here to fight for these people, or their approval. She was here to fight for what that flag stood for, and nothing else. The prosecutor rose, crisp and deliberate. "Your Honor," he began, his tone as sterile and precise as a scalpel. "The defendant willfully abandoned her assigned position, endangered her team, and compromised a meticulously planned military operation. This case is not about heroics, it is about discipline, about order, about the critical importance of following lawful commands." Ripples of agreement moved through the room, quiet nods, subtle smirks. To them, she was just another reckless young woman who thought she knew better than her commanders. In the front row sat Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, leaning back with a thin, satisfied smile. He didn't even bother to mask the smugness on his face. This trial, for him, was more than charges and testimony. It was proof. Proof, as he'd written in his own report, that women had no place in special operations, that they cracked under pressure, that their emotional decision-making, as he'd called it, made them a liability. Typical female response. Each phrase landed on Emma like a blow, but she absorbed them all, showing nothing. She had been trained for years to endure worse than public humiliation. She kept her head high, shoulders square, even as the whispers behind her cut like knives. 24 years old and already causing international incidents, one voice hissed. "Should have stayed in a support role where she belonged," said another. "This is what happens when you lower standards for political correctness," came a third. The words twisted deeper than the restraints at her wrists, but she'd learned long ago that ignorance was a battle she couldn't win with words. Only her record could speak for her, if anyone in this room even bothered to read it. Admiral Gregory Shaw sat at the bench, hands resting on the thick file before him, the file that would decide her fate. He had presided over countless courts-martial in his decades of service. He'd seen soldiers crumble under pressure, let fear or ego override training, make irreversible mistakes. That pattern had become familiar. He opened her file expecting more of the same. Mediocre reviews, spotty discipline, telltale warning signs missed by her superiors. But what he found made his blood run cold. 2 words stared up at him from the page. Ghost Operator. His fingers stiffened on the folder. His breath caught, just slightly. Shaw knew that term better than anyone alive. because he had built the program himself, brick by brick, test by brutal test 20 years ago. He knew every threshold, every psychological gauntlet. The ghost operator pipeline was designed to break even the best, and 9% of candidates washed out within days. Those rare few who survived the process weren't just elite soldiers. They became something more. Legends. Operators so lethal, so unshakably resilient, that they accomplished missions even Tier 1 units wouldn't dare touch. Shaw flipped through the pages faster now, his disbelief mounting with every line. Perfect scores. Every evaluation. Psychological assessments placing her in the top 1% of all military personnel. Mission after mission that read like scenes from an action film, only real, and somehow more incredible. And then he found her final evaluation, and his hands stilled. Lieutenant Briggs represents the absolute pinnacle of special operations capability. Her tactical awareness, combat effectiveness, and psychological stability under extreme stress are unmatched in my 20-year career. She embodies everything the Ghost Operator program was created to produce. The signature at the bottom of the page was his own. 3 years ago, he had written those words himself. Now, staring down at them, Admiral Shaw realized with a sinking weight that he wasn't just looking at another personnel file. He was staring at the very thing his life's work had been meant to create, sitting there in restraints, on trial. Culmination of everything he had spent his career building. The perfect soldier, the one he had dreamed of creating for decades. And here she was, sitting in his courtroom, wrists bound in steel, facing charges that threatened to erase everything she had fought for. Admiral Gregory Shaw's always lifted from the thick dossier in his hands, his normally unshakable composure cracking as recognition, in a dawning horror, settled into his features. The young woman before him wasn't just another soldier who had snapped under pressure, as the report suggested. She was something else entirely. She was his ghost operator, the embodiment of everything he believed special operations could and should be. The invisible blade in the dark, the whisper no enemy heard until it was too late. His voice, when it finally came, was low but carried easily through the stunned silence of the courtroom. "This defendant," he said, his tone sharper now, cutting through the stillness like a scalpel, "is a confirmed ghost operator." He paused, letting the words hang there, his brow furrowed. Why wasn't this disclosed during the preliminary briefing? Across the aisle, the prosecuting attorney blinked at him in confusion, clearly out of his depth. "Sir," he stammered. "What's a ghost operator?" Shaw's jaw tightened as he closed the file with a trembling hand, the paper whispering as it fell shut. His eyes stayed locked on Emma Briggs. He saw past the orange jumpsuit, past the cuffs digging into her wrists, and for the first time in months, someone truly saw her for who she was. In that moment, the air in the room shifted. The collective hush wasn't born of discipline or decorum, but of something heavier, the weight of a truth no one in the room was ready for. Emma met his gaze at last. Her quiet brown eyes were steady, calm in the middle of the storm. She hadn't expected recognition. She hadn't asked for respect. But seeing the understanding bloom on Shaw's face felt to her like sunlight breaking through a long winter sky. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she wasn't just some woman soldier who had messed up, another cautionary tale. She was who she had always been, one of the most elite, most effective warriors the American military had ever produced. Some records, Shaw thought grimly, aren't written to be read aloud. They're written to command silence and reflection. What defines a person? The angry accusations of a crowd? Or the quiet, unshakable truth buried deep inside a classified file? Shaw's voice rose again, firm and deliberate, slicing through the thick quiet. "This proceeding is hereby suspended, effective immediately," he declared, "pending a full review of classified materials." The prosecution attorney shot to his feet in protest. "Your Honor, we object. The defendant's prior service record doesn't—" "Counselor," Shaw cut him off, his tone cold as steel and heavy with decades of command experience. "You clearly don't understand what or who you're dealing with. I'm ordering a complete intelligence review." He stood, his chair scraping behind him. "This court will reconvene only after I have reviewed every piece of this file personally. Do I make myself clear?" The lawyer sat back down, looking small and rattled. Around them, quiet murmurs of confusion rippled through the room, but Shaw ignored them all. He was already moving, already decided, making a choice that he knew would be talked about in military circles for years to come. Without hesitation, he stepped down from the bench and strode toward the defense table, where Emma still sat, cuffed and silent. The court security officer immediately interjected, his voice quivering. "Admiral, sir, protocol requires." Shaw held up one hand, silencing him with nothing more than a glance. He had spent 20 years building the Ghost Operator program out of thin air, carving it from shadows and silence, brick by invisible brick. He didn't need protocol to tell him what kind of soldier sat before him now, bound and waiting in his courtroom. Later, in the privacy of his chambers, he spread Emma Briggs's entire personnel file across his desk and read every word. What he found there strained belief. Her psychological evaluations painted a portrait of a mind honed to a razor's edge, capable of processing and responding to tactical information under pressures that would break most human beings. Borderline superhuman. Her physical assessments placed her in the 99th percentile of all special operations forces, not just strong, but fast, enduring, unstoppable. But it was the mission reports that truly left him reeling. Operation Nightfall, she had single-handedly infiltrated a fortified terrorist compound, extracted 3 captured intelligence officers, and eliminated 17 hostiles in the process. Operation Silent Thunder, she had slipped into a clandestine weapons facility, gathered critical intelligence, and averted a major terrorist attack on American soil. Operation Dawn's Edge, she had spent 6 weeks alone, deep behind enemy lines, gathering information that led to the dismantling of an entire terror network. 23 missions, 0 failures, 0 casualties among personnel under her protection. And then, the mission that had landed her here facing a court-martial. Shaw turned to that final report, his fingers hesitating over the page, his breath catching. Whatever it said, he already knew. She wasn't just a soldier, she was his ghost operator. Admiral Gregory Shaw felt a leaden sickness settle in his chest as he read through the classified after-action report that Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb had tried so hard to bury. The truth was in the pages, plain as day. Emma Briggs hadn't just saved an 8-year-old girl. She had identified the child as the daughter of a high-value intelligence asset who was secretly cooperating with U.S. forces. That split-second decision of hers to break formation and rush into danger had prevented the catastrophic loss of their most critical source in the region. The mission had succeeded because of her actions, not in spite of them. And yet here she was, sitting in court, facing prison. Shaw's stomach turned. The greatest tactical mind he had encountered in his entire career was on the verge of being destroyed by bureaucratic prejudice and the petty vendetta of a superior officer who clearly couldn't see past his own pride. When court reconvened 3 hours later, the atmosphere was charged, electric. Word had spread across the base that something unusual, something extraordinary was happening. Every seat in the gallery was filled, and more people crowded along the walls, straining to see. Shaw entered the courtroom, his stride steady but his pulse hammering. Under his arm, he carried Emma's full personnel file, with the recently declassified sections marked by bright yellow tabs. He had always lived his career by the book, priding himself on discipline and procedure. But today, he thought grimly, the book was going to have to be rewritten. He stopped at the center of the courtroom and turned to face everyone present. His voice carried to the farthest corners as he began. "Ladies and gentlemen," Shaw said, each syllable measured and deliberate, "I owe this court, and especially the defendant, an apology." He raised the thick file for all to see. "What I hold in my hands is not the record of a reckless soldier who cracked under pressure," he continued. His gaze swept over the packed room, his tone sharp enough to cut through the murmur that rippled in the gallery. "This is the service history of one of the most elite warriors this nation has ever produced." The murmuring grew louder, but Shaw pressed on without flinching. "Lieutenant Emma Briggs," he declared, "is a ghost operator, a member of the most classified special operations unit in existence. The selection process for this program is so brutal, so rigorous, that fewer than 1% of all candidates ever qualify, and those who do become legends. He opened the file, flipping to the marked pages, and began to read aloud from her evaluations. Tactical brilliance that borders on precognitive, Shaw read, his voice unwavering. Psychological resilience unmatched in my experience. The most naturally gifted operator I have encountered in 25 years of special operations. He closed the file with a sharp snap, letting the words hang in the stunned silence that followed. Then his eyes found Emma's across the room, clear, unyielding, and proud. The action that brought Lieutenant Briggs before this court, he said, was not a failure of judgment. It was precisely the kind of decision-making we train our most elite operators to execute under impossible circumstances. He extended a hand toward the prosecution table, his voice rising just enough to ensure no one missed his next words. The charges leveled against this woman are not only unfounded, they betray a fundamental misunderstanding of what exceptional service truly looks like. For a long, breathless moment, the room was silent. Every single person there began to grasp they were witnessing history in the making. Then Shaw moved, slowly and deliberately. He stepped down from his bench, his polished shoes ringing against the floor, and approached Emma's table. From his pocket, he drew a small silver key. "Lieutenant Briggs," he said, his voice loud enough for all to hear. His tone was no longer that of an admiral, but of something deeper, something personal. "As the architect of the Ghost Operator program, I can tell you without hesitation that no one in this room has earned the right to wear those restraints less than you." He reached down and unlocked her handcuffs himself. The sharp metallic click of the steel falling away echoed through the hushed courtroom. But Shaw wasn't finished. As Emma rubbed her wrists, still too stunned to speak, Shaw did something no one had ever seen in a military courtroom before. He straightened to full height, squared his shoulders, and saluted her. "Lieutenant," he said solemnly, "your service to this nation has been extraordinary. The secrecy demanded by your missions means you may never receive the public recognition you deserve. But here, today, in this room, your sacrifice is acknowledged." For a beat, the room was still. Then one by one, every uniformed person in the courtroom rose to their feet and saluted her. The prosecuting attorney, the court officers, the observers in the gallery. All of them standing in silent, profound respect for the woman before them. Emma stood at attention, her chin high even as the tears she had held back for so many months finally spilled over. They were not tears of shame, nor even relief, but of recognition. For the first time since her arrest, she felt seen for who she truly was. Shaw returned to his bench, the weight of the moment heavy in the air, and delivered his final ruling. His voice was firm, unyielding, and to Emma more beautiful than anything she had ever heard. "All charges against Lieutenant Emma Briggs," he pronounced, "are hereby dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, I am recommending her for immediate promotion and reassignment to lead the next generation. Train. This is why we endure what others cannot. This is why we sacrifice." The gavel's final strike still rang faintly in Emma's ears as she stepped out of that suffocating courtroom. Rows of uniformed service members lined her path, their crisp salutes raised in perfect unison as she passed between them. She returned each salute with quiet grace, but inside her chest, a storm of relief and vindication roared louder than any cheering crowd could have. Months of accusations, whispers behind her back, the crushing weight of a system that had seemed eager to discard her, all of it finally slid from her shoulders. She had entered that room as a disgraced defendant, a shadow of the operator she once was. But she walked out a legend, not just acquitted, but immortalized as the kind of warrior whose story would echo through barracks and classrooms for years to come. And behind her, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb sat slumped in stunned silence, his hands clasped uselessly in front of him as the courtroom emptied. The man who had plotted so meticulously to destroy her career now looked as if the very ground beneath him had crumbled. He'd wanted to prove her expendable. Instead, he had proven why she could never be replaced. Before the day was even over, word of Emma's vindication rippled through the tight-knit military community. Classified details of her missions, of course, remained sealed away, as they always would. But the headline that a ghost operator, a myth to most, had been publicly honored by the highest levels of command sent a shockwave of pride through her peers. At the base where she'd been stationed, the special operations community came together that evening in a quiet ceremony, private just for them. No reporters, no cameras, no reporters clamoring for comment. Just those who truly understood what her victory meant. Admiral Gregory Shaw himself stood at the center of the gathering, a figure of calm authority, holding a black velvet case that none of them had ever seen outside a secure briefing room. Inside were Emma's real commendation medals, earned in missions no one was allowed to talk about. "Ladies and gentlemen," Shaw began, his voice resonant in the dimly lit hangar, "for reasons you all understand, you will never know the full scope of Lieutenant Briggs' service. Much of what she has done will remain in the dark, as it must. But what I can tell you is this. She has stopped attacks that would have cost thousands of American lives. Because of her, countless families are whole tonight who never even knew how close they came to loss." After the ceremony, younger officers lingered nearby, watching Emma with a mixture of awe and curiosity. They'd heard rumors of ghost operators their whole careers, but never met one before. One young lieutenant finally approached, his voice quiet, reverent. "Ma'am, how do you carry it? The weight of missions that can never be acknowledged." Emma paused, choosing her words carefully. She looked him in the eyes and said, "You carry it by remembering the mission is bigger than the recognition. Some victories don't get parades. They're measured in the attacks that never happen, in the families who never have to grieve." Later, Captain Sarah Chen sought her out. One of the few other female officers in special operations, she offered Emma a knowing smile before speaking, her tone low and earnest. "What you went through," Chen said, "the public humiliation, not knowing if justice would win out. How did you keep it together?" Emma's lips curved into something halfway between a smile and a grimace. "I didn't," she admitted. "There were nights I questioned everything. But I learned something important through all of it. Your value isn't determined by whether others see it. It's determined by whether you do." Before the night was over, Admiral Shaw gathered his senior staff and made the announcement official. Emma Briggs was being promoted to lieutenant commander and placed in charge of designing the next generation of ghost operator training. "She's uniquely qualified," Shaw told them, "not just because of her field experience, but because she's paid the personal cost of elite service and walked out stronger. You can't teach that from a textbook." Her first training class assembled the following week, 12 candidates, 8 men, 4 women. Even that ratio felt revolutionary to some of the old guard, but Emma didn't dwell on it. She wasn't interested in counting heads. She was interested in finding those rare few who could endure what she had endured. On their first day, she stood before them and asked a simple question. "Who here can tell me the difference between following orders and executing the mission?" One eager candidate shot his hand up. "Ma'am, following orders keeps the unit together. Executing the mission gets it done." Emma nodded, but her gaze was sharp as a blade. "Partly right, but sometimes those two are at odds, and when that happens, you'll find out who you really are." She gestured to a framed photograph on the wall, not of weapons, not of any battlefield, but of an 8-year-old girl with bright, fearful eyes, the girl Emma had saved on her final mission. "This," Emma said, her voice quiet but unshakable, "is why we train. This is why we push ourselves beyond what seems possible. This is why we sacrifice. Not for glory, not for medals, for her. We do what we do, not for the recognition, not for the medals or commendations, but for the people out there who will never even know our names." The room grew still as that truth settled over the new candidates like a heavy, invisible weight. Every pair of eyes was fixed forward with anticipation and quiet dread. They knew now that their training would push them beyond every limit they thought they had. Some of them, maybe most of them, wouldn't make it to the end. But those who did would earn their place in a brotherhood and sisterhood that transcended rank, gender, and every other superficial distinction that civilians seemed to care about. As the weeks turned into months, Emma began to notice something she never would have imagined for herself. She was becoming a symbol. Not just for women in the special operations community, though there was no denying that part of it. She became a symbol for anyone who'd ever been underestimated, misunderstood, or falsely accused. Letters started pouring in from all over the world, from soldiers who'd faced similar doubts, from young women thinking about enlisting but afraid they'd never be accepted, from commanders unsure how to recognize excellence when it came in unexpected forms. Emma read every one of them, sometimes into the late hours of the night. Whenever she could, she wrote back, understanding now that her public vindication had given her something she'd never asked for, a platform. And she intended to use it. That evening, she found herself walking through the base memorial garden, her boots crunching softly over the gravel path as she traced the rows of names etched into stone. She thought about her own path, the sting of cold handcuffs on her wrists, the humiliation of standing accused, and finally the quiet relief when justice at last prevailed. She was no longer just Lieutenant Emma Briggs, the ghost operator whose name had barely been known outside her own unit. She had become something more than herself, living proof that truth, no matter how deeply buried, would always find a way to the surface. A year later, Emma stood in her dress uniform before a congressional committee convened to review the military's justice procedures. Her posture was perfect. Her hands steady even though her heart beat like a drum in her chest. Behind her sat Admiral Gregory Shaw and a panel of the nation's highest-ranking officers, their faces impassive but their eyes attentive. "Commander Briggs," the chair began, "your case has raised important questions about how we evaluate service members who operate outside conventional parameters. What would you say to us about the nature of true military justice?" Emma took a quiet breath before answering. She wanted to get it right. "Senator," she began, her voice firm but calm, "sometimes all people see is the uniform or the handcuffs, and they forget that there's a whole person and a whole record behind both." She gestured to the thick file of her case resting on the table in front of her. "Military justice isn't just about punishment. It's about seeing the full context of service, especially for those of us who operate in ways that can't always be publicly acknowledged." The room held its silence. "1 year ago, I wasn't judged by the 23 successful missions I had completed," she continued. "I was judged by a single action, misunderstood and taken out of context. The difference between justice and injustice often comes down to whether we're willing to look deeper than surface appearances." Senator Martinez leaned forward, his expression intent. "Commander," he asked, "what message would you give to other service members who might face similar challenges, to those whose value may not always be recognized?" Emma didn't hesitate. "That your value is never diminished by someone else's inability to see it," she said evenly. "Some battles are fought in enemy territory. Others are fought in courtrooms, but the mission remains the same: serve with honor, whether that honor is recognized or not." She let herself pause then, thinking of the young operator she was mentoring now, someone who reminded her of herself years ago. "Every person in uniform," she went on, "will face a moment when they have to choose between what's easy and what's right. And when that moment comes, choose right. The recognition might come later, or it might never come at all. But at the end of the day, you'll still be able to look yourself in the mirror." When it came time for Admiral Shaw to deliver closing remarks, he stood and addressed the committee with a gravity that filled the room. "What we saw in that courtroom," he said, "wasn't just the vindication of one officer. It was a reminder that excellence doesn't always announce itself with drums and fanfare. Sometimes it sits quietly in handcuffs, waiting for justice to catch up to truth." When the hearing adjourned, Emma stepped outside into the warm afternoon light and was surprised to find a group of young military academy cadets waiting for her near the steps. "Ma'am," one of them said, nervously clutching a notebook, "we've been studying your case in our ethics class. Could you tell us, how did you know you were making the right choice during that final mission?" Emma's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "I didn't know," she admitted. "You never know for certain. But when you see someone who needs help and you have the ability to give it, uncertainty is never a good excuse for inaction." That evening, she returned to her office. On the balcony hung a simple wooden plaque with a quiet but powerful inscription. "In the world of heroes, there are two kinds of silence: the deafening silence of recognition and the chilling silence of a legend wrongly accused. And when that silence is finally broken, the entire military stands at attention." Emma stood there for a moment, her fingers grazing the edge of the plaque. She knew now, better than ever, that some warriors don't arrive with trumpets or banners. They walk through quietly, changing the very institutions they serve, and leave the world pausing in respect.